Hey, Cypher here. Today we're going to be looking at the 1920 versus 2020 episode. To fix some of the problems with it, I made a video last year, roughly about a year ago, that was purporting to compare 1920 to 2020. Well, it's 2021, and it is time to update that video. Instead of a, editing new narrative and all that kind of stuff, this is basically going to be a live reaction, although when it comes to YouTube, I will be editing this a little bit. As you can see, this was originally streamed on Twitch for anybody who, is not watching it on Twitch right now. Always can come to my Twitch, which is twitch.tv/cynicalhistorian. We will see how much I got right, how much I got wrong. I think overall the video still holds up a little bit, but there are some glaring deficiencies, to say the least. Hey, Cypher here, coming at you with a pretty quickly put together video. I've been getting numerous requests to make a video talking about the current crisis that we're facing, like the pandemic right now, and like the Spanish flu from a century ago. So understandably, people look to the past for historical precedent to reassure themselves of what the future holds. Or at least the consolation of saying, well, it ain't that bad. But I don't think I can really do either of those justice. Honestly, I don't exactly know how to look at all this craziness myself. Obviously, it isn't as bad as a century ago. I don't think any intelligent observer could say otherwise. Yeah, right, dude. The beginning of the video is obviously the kind of like introduction, like an introduction to a, proper essay. And you can tell that the thesis of the video is basically, hey, it's not as bad as 1920. I think that still definitely holds up. Like, the main thesis of the video absolutely holds up. Interestingly enough, I think either this or a previous video was the first time Crypto showed up. He doesn't show up very often, but every once in a while when he does, I end up getting a bunch of people who are just angry that he's even there, which, I don't know, I find that kind of fun, actually. The people that I piss off with having him show up are the people I want to piss off. They're the people who need to go. But he's always a foil, hence why I call him the cynical straw man. I actually created a separate channel for him, specifically so that I could have Cypher talking on the main channel, but then have like angry response comments in the comments for it. And then over the course of the year, the actual channel, Crypto the Cynical Straw Man, turned into where I just put random shit posts. I've been dumping clips there every once in a while that have nothing to do with anything. This is the interesting thing about Crypto, is he's also kind of a character that, represents what I was when I was, like, beginning college, like a college freshman. Let's get back to the video. 2020 is way worse than 1920. You don't know what you're talking about. Look here, it's the cynical straw man, Crypto. Bruh, the world is ending, and you're just a puppet for their propaganda. We gotta go out and buy as much toilet paper as we possibly can. Okay, calm down. It isn't that bad. We've seen people panic buying and doing all kinds of crazy stuff, but remember when the worst of this was from everybody panic buying and taking up all the toilet paper? March of 2020 seems like 10 years ago, not frickin' one. But Crypto here is acting crazy and causing the craziness, not out of a good reaction, but through ignorance. Who are you calling ignorant? The fact is, historians, just like everybody else, tend to freak out in the present.
Come on, baby, what the?
Historical precedent. We've never seen this before.
Could this be the end of the world?
But when we finally have...
It really does feel like that whenever something like when the insurrection happened in January. I remember like talking with some historian friends, and we were all doing that. It's like, this has never happened before. I don't know what to do. Funny thing is, there's a bit of a glitch in that clip because it rendered where it was supposed to say this has never happened before, but it just ends up saying this has never happened, but I'm perpetually having computer problems, so I was having computer problems. And I just decided, screw it, can't get it to render properly, I'm just going to put it out like that anyways. Let's continue.
Have sufficient hindsight, we see that this wasn't only predictable, but kinda mundane. You don't know how bad it'll get, they aren't even telling us the truth.
Oh crap, crypto was right. I didn't know how bad it would get, and the government was actually perpetuating a bunch of lies about the coronavirus. Oops. Crypto here is more representing the conspiracy theorists, you know. While the surface level kind of sentiment is correct, the lower level of this of crypto is absolutely wrong. And that's the point.
Are you seriously trying to tell us that everything's gonna be fine? You're just a historian, if I'm willing to give you that. Okay, look, I can't say that right now, obviously. I don't have sufficient hindsight. So crypto, you are right in that regard. Well, it's about time I get some credit around.
Oh. I guess I actually did say crypto is correct there. All right. Well, I'm correcting my correction then.
Around here. But knowing that hindsight is coming, I often find myself playing the moderating voice.
75 years later.
Where have I seen this before? Here it is.
And I can say for sure, the sun will rise tomorrow.
You would not believe the amount of pushback I got from those clips, from YouTube commenters. People were pissed that I even had the gall to say that this wasn't actually that bad. And the funny thing is, I was correct in that regard.
Nonetheless, there are some striking parallels to the 19-teens and 20s to where we are with the 20-teens and 2020s. And looking at them may give us some very necessary perspective. It's morally ambiguous, as all history is, but maybe we can learn a little bit by looking at today's parallels from a century ago. I put up on Twitter and Facebook a version of this little list, and I just want to talk about what these parallels might mean. So first is just the idea of the Roaring 20s. You know, we look at the 20s as a pretty good time for the United States. The economy was booming, and it was the age of jazz and speakeasies, and woo, what a fun time, at least until the Great Depression. But actually, there were some significant problems at the beginning of the 1920s at least. And the first of those was what's called the nadir of race relations. As in, Jim Crow was basically fully implemented in the South, and actually in a lot of other places. Black disenfranchisement was all over the place, and far worse than it had been in the 1880s. Also, in 1919, there were more lynchings that year than any other year in the United States. Plus that year had Red Summer, which was a series of race riots that were almost the equivalent of race massacres. And there would be continuous problems all the way into the 1920s. In fact, one of the worst of these was in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921, where there were airplanes literally dropping dynamite on people just because they were of a different skin tone.
Another slight correction, it wasn't dynamite, it was firebombs. But you could see here the destruction. Colorized by the Smithsonian, by the way.
The Tulsa riot is more aptly named the Tulsa Massacre, because, yeah, white people really did massacre black people in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921. That was terrible, and we're not seeing anything anywhere close to that now. There is no parallel to that. Sure, we definitely have some race problems. For instance, how we're treating detainees at the border is somewhat abhorrent. But it's nothing like having mass lynchings.
This is the first point where I, dropped the ball a bit, because who would have expected there to be another long, hot summer in 2020? And since this came out in March, this was actually before the George Floyd protests. And the George Floyd protests turned into riots pretty quickly. The police also cracked down in a horrendous way. Far worse than we had seen in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014. The George Floyd protests really brought to the surface a lot of racial tensions and developed into a bunch of race riots. Very much like the race riots of 1967, which a lot of those were predicated on police brutality. And because this was such a big issue, I actually made videos about the history of race riots in the US, specifically white versus black race riots, and police brutality as well. Interestingly enough, because of recent videos, people keep on claiming that I've never talked about things like the 1619 Project or Antifa or whatever, but I actually have. The people who say I haven't are just ignoramuses, because that's what YouTube comments are half the time. But as you can see, this is quite a missing point in this video, and probably the worst thing I got wrong on it. I was alluding to a lot of racial issues. I allude to children being caged at the border and everything. But systemic racism has a lot of other deeper roots. But it's still nothing, absolutely nothing compared to what it was like in 1920 when Jim Crow was still the law of the land. In fact, Woodrow Wilson had segregated the federal government. Anyways, let's get on with it.
But there is a significant parallel to 1919 and 1920 to today, and that's on the idea of progress. Because Woodrow Wilson was president in 1919 and 1920.
Wilson!
Now, I would never say that this president is as bad as Wilson. I don't think this president is particularly capable of being as bad as Wilson. But I don't think anybody in their right mind is going to say that he's been a good president either.
Oh man, the amount of pushback I got on that one too. The people saying how dare you say that he's a bad president? He is. Absolutely. And boy did it get worse. It got worse. Way worse. We had an insurrection in the Capitol egged on by his rhetoric. I'm still having trouble comprehending how that relates to precedent. Woodrow Wilson, for instance, in his cabinet actually had, people who had participated in the Wilmington coup. Having any kind of parallels to Woodrow Wilson like that is a pretty bad sign. Trump was certainly an oafish tyrant, but Wilson was an articulate tyrant, and an articulate tyrant is always worse than an oafish tyrant.
And Wilson really represents the end of progressivism. And we'll see, but maybe Trump is the end of progressivism in the early 21st century. But yeah, one terrible president in 1920, I'd say the worst, and a pretty terrible president in 2020. That's a pretty significant parallel, especially when you're looking at how they both treated progressivism. The next check mark...
Something fun that came out after the insurrection was that 1776 report. Trump's administration literally labeled progressivism as an existential threat to the republic. Whoa, what kind of distorted perspective? If you hear me saying at least Wilson did something, you know it's bad. But at least Wilson actually believed in progressivism. He just wanted a more moderate form. At the very least, most American presidents have an idea of where the nation should go, and it's not backwards. Very few presidents have been so ultra-conservative that they literally want to regress the nation. Wilson was certainly not one of those. Of course, his idea of progress was flawed, to say the least. My lecture on Wilsonian America literally is Wilson's America, subtitled The End of Progress. He destroyed progressivism, but destroyed it from within. He was an extreme conservative, true, but he still believed that the nation should become better. His idea of better was segregation and violent interventions that led to long-term occupations, but, you know, at least he had an idea of progress rather than regress. We all think we're the good guy, right?
Is global war. Now, obviously, we're not in a world war, although that was trending on Twitter earlier this year, though
God,
I'm pretty sure everybody who used that hashtag has no idea what a world war is. But we are in a global war on terror. Yeah, the global war on terror is a global war. One could say a world war. And it's all over the place, from Western Africa all the way to the Philippines. But there are significant differences. We don't have a draft. We don't have the Espionage and Sedition Acts. We don't have an entire...
Well, we do have the Espionage Act. We just don't have the Espionage and Sedition Acts.
War economy, but then again, we have significant federal funding into a military-industrial complex, and we also have, like, the Patriot Act, which has a lot of the same problems that the Sedition Act had. And although World War I ended in 1918, there were still conflicts ongoing all the way into the 1920s. For instance, there was the Allied intervention into the Russian Civil War, which continued all the way until 1920, and for the Japanese, it continued until 1922. So today, we have troops still in Afghanistan, still in Iraq, some in Syria, some all over the place. We have troops all over the world. So while we're definitely in a lesser form of global war than back in 1920, the one today is still all-pervasive.
This still holds up pretty well. You know, we're still very much in a global war. If you thought that Biden was going to be any better, nope. He has escalated tensions in Iran, continued to do drone strikes in massive numbers, although Trump had escalated drone strikes beyond even Obama, and Obama was pretty frickin' bad. This global war on terror thing is not going away during this administration, at least. We might be drawing down, but we drew down in Vietnam in 1970. We did not get out of Vietnam until 1973. So, you know, we've got a ways to go.
The next check mark is postponed Olympics, because back in 1916, the Olympics were postponed. Now, they weren't in 1920, so we're fudging the numbers here a little bit, but World War I canceled the 1916 Olympics, and the 2020 pandemic has postponed the current Olympics. It's actually the first time that that's happened because of anything other than war. And the Olympics are kind of a big deal because it's when the entire world comes together to do some sports. It has significant cultural meaning. But let's move on to the next check mark, fear of revolution. In 1919, all the way into 1920, there was the Red Scare. Funny how many of these things I've already done episodes on, huh? But the Red Scare was fed by the idea that socialist revolutionaries were coming to the United States. Oh no! You had the chief of the Bureau of Investigation ordering a bunch of deportations and arrests simply on suspicion of being red. And there were a bunch of strikes and all kinds of craziness, all tainted with the fear of Bolsheviks invading America. And while 2020 is certainly not at that level, if you've watched anything covering folks like Bernie Sanders, you'd realize that there's an equal amount of that kind of red-baiting rhetoric going about. It's just not reinforced with violence.
Kind of got that one wrong, too. Think about how much we've heard about Antifa and all the scaremongering about how Antifa's coming to ruin America. That, like, the police need to crack down on all of these rioters because they're going to foment a revolution and overthrow democracy. And it's like, Antifa, for the most part, are a bunch of frickin' like teenagers and 20-somethings dressed all in black and counter-protesting stuff. Like, that's essentially all they are, is a bunch of counter-protesters. They absolutely do engage in violence, and political violence should not be tolerated. But It's not like this plot to overthrow America or anything, and yet you will hear people saying that, especially after the insurrection, where people were like, yeah, but well, what about Antifa? It's like, what about them? It wasn't Antifa trying to overthrow a free and fair election by invading the Capitol. We certainly saw it get a lot worse over the course of 2020 and early 2021. So luckily that kind of craziness is over. We were basically in a Red Scare, just a much less worse one. It's not like we were packing up all the anarchists and shipping them off to Russia. We didn't have the Palmer raids or anything along those lines. We didn't have the biggest domestic spying organization in American history. So it's not as bad as then, but it was pretty bad.
And the Reds had won the Cold War. There were executions in Central Park, and I might have been one of the ones getting executed. I don't know who Bernie supports over these years.
But then again, Bernie is not getting the nomination, and we'll get to how that's paralleled here too. But yeah, all this fear-mongering about socialist revolutionaries has redoubled itself in modern rhetoric. Just not as vitriolically, and it's actually kind of an American tradition to fearmonger about socialism. That goes all the way back to the 1850s. So let's just go to the next thing.
Yep, you can find, literally during the sectional crisis, people arguing over, like, how the Republicans were too socialist. And it's really funny to hear people complaining about the radicalism of Republicans now, right? But the parties have switched. I just finished editing that a week ago, so I expect that video sometime soon.
A crime wave, because there was a bunch of lynchings and race riots and all kinds of stuff happening in 1919, and then there was another wave of crime in 1920 because of, well, something that we'll get to in just a second, Prohibition. But in the United States, we're seeing quite the opposite of a crime wave, because crime has actually gone significantly down over the last few decades, though there's a lot of arguments as to why there was a crime drop. In either case, it happened, and we are living in significantly more peaceful times. So let's go to the next check mark, and probably the most important for everyone watching, global pandemic. COVID-19 is scary enough to have the government shutting down pretty much everything and ordering people to stay at home. And the same thing happened in 1918 and 1919 with the Spanish flu. But there are some significant differences between COVID-19 and Spanish flu. One, the death toll is not comparable at all. Spanish flu...
Notice how dated those numbers are. Roughly around 50 million dead because of the Spanish flu, and we're now nowhere close to that. Also, you have to take into account the fact that the world's population is significantly higher. 50 million people dying then is a lot worse than 50 million people dying now. And we're still nowhere close to 50 million. In fact, let's look up the numbers right now. Whoa, we went over 500,000? We're about to hit the same number as of American dead as the Spanish flu. The Spanish flu actually got up to about 600,000 in the United States. But once again, U.S. is currently more than 3 times its size in 1920. 2.6 million deaths worldwide. So that's, there's probably some underreporting in that. So, let's round it up to 3 million. 3 million still is nothing compared to Spanish flu, but it is still ongoing. The second wave is over, and the second wave tends to always be the worst. There's a bunch of new strains, and you don't know what could happen. We don't know. It could get worse. Who knows? Maybe even the vaccines aren't going to be good against some of these new strains. We just don't know. In either case, we've already gone through a second wave, and we're still not above 3 million deaths. Like, that's actually not that bad compared to Spanish flu at all, considering, Spanish flu is 50 million. And, that's right on the heels of the First World War. Although, you do have to think that part of the reason why the Spanish flu was so deadly was because of the First World War. People were not allowed to talk about it. In fact, the reason why it's called the Spanish flu is because Spain didn't have any checks on any censorship of their news media because they were not at war. And so it possibly originated in Kansas. Calling it the Spanish flu is a bit of a misnomer, but it's a relic of the World War I censorship. But the high amount of deaths weren't purely because of censorship. It was because so many people were moving around the world. You know, you get that many people moving around the place, they tend to spread disease, especially before we have things like antibiotics. And think about it this way, the Spanish flu typically killed younger people.
It killed between 50 and 100 million people. We haven't reached even 100,000 deaths with COVID-19.
And realize when I'm saying 100,000 deaths there, I'm not referring to the United States. I was actually referring to the world.
In fact, we're nowhere close while I'm recording this, and I'm guessing that by the time I release this episode, it still will be nowhere close to 100,000. So 100 million versus 100,000?
The world didn't hit 100,000 until almost a month after I released this episode, by the way.
It's literally orders of magnitude of difference. But part of why Spanish flu was so much worse was that we had no way of controlling the symptoms. A lot of people ended up dying of pneumonia, not the actual flu, because the pneumonia worked on a compromised immune system created by the flu, and people ended up basically drowning in their own lungs. But here's the thing, pneumonia is a bacteria, and we can treat bacterial infection now.
Okay, so there is such a thing as viral pneumonia, and that's actually what the coronavirus causes. We're working off of faulty data because, you know, the idea of a virus was barely a thing in 1918. What appears to have killed the most people was that they would have an adverse reaction. Their immune system would overload, and then basically they would become immunocompromised, allowing for bacteria to infect their lungs and cause bacterial pneumonia. That appears to be why so many young people died, was actually because they had stronger immune systems. You know, obviously the reason why older people are dying from coronavirus now is because they have weaker immune systems. It was literally the strength of people's immune systems caused them to die in 1918. So, a little bit different from today. And, you know, the point I'm making here is also, like, we have, is still holds up quite well. For instance, we had the second wave here, and the second wave actually didn't cause that much of a spike in deaths, partially because we could handle it. The initial spike came from, you know, not knowing how to handle the coronavirus because it was a novel virus. And now we're perfectly capable of dealing with it, and so less people are dying than before. And especially now that we have the vaccine and everything, it's things are getting a lot better really quick.
We have penicillin and all the other types of antibacterial drugs. And then there's like respirators and other kinds of things of helping deal with the symptoms of COVID-19. Another major difference from 1918 is that we have epidemiology, which is the study of epidemics. And while that existed in 1918, it was a very rudimentary science. Nowadays, we can figure out where we need to close down and all that kind of stuff. That's why we have all of these closures so quickly when the numbers seem so low. Like, I'm having to create lectures from home. I attended a conference digitally, and VidCon is canceled, so I'm not going to that either. It all actually means a lot more work on my part, but maybe I'll turn those lectures into episodes one day.
I mean, shameless plug, I totally did that. All three of those things I turned into episodes.
And I'm sure most people have these kinds of experiences. And that is the working of epidemiology. They're telling us we need to stay home. Or, as the president says it, social distancing! And there's one further difference from the 1918 flu. World War I isn't going on, so everybody isn't spreading it. We have the ability to shut down airports. We didn't have the ability to stop troops from coming home. So yeah, while it can seem a bit scary and there are people dying, this is nowhere close to as bad as the Spanish flu.
Considering we're having mask-wearing protests, for instance, there was a bunch of people in Idaho just like a week ago or something like that who were like burning masks. Interestingly enough, that totally happened in 1918 as well. The parallels can be pretty striking, and more so than I even let on in this video.
Nowhere close to as bad as the Spanish flu. So let's move on to the next checkmark, which, admittedly, is kind of me just being a little silly. The worst amendment to the United States Constitution, the 18th, Prohibition, thereby making the 21st Amendment, which repealed it, the best amendment. Here to the 21st Amendment. Obviously, we are not imposing prohibition, but what we are doing is closing bars. Most states have imposed bans on bars, or at least close gatherings, which bars entail. Suffice it to say, that has been a great blow to my morale. But when I had that list, I'm literally just saying closed bars, not actual prohibition.
Although some people pointed out that we do have kind of a prohibition against drugs. You know, the war on drugs could be said to be a prohibition, but, that's a very different beast.
We are obviously not facing real prohibition. Luckily. Times would be far worse if we were. But alongside Prohibition came the 19th Amendment just a few months later, and that was women's suffrage, which is basically the only constitutional right that women have, at least if you take the Constitution very literally. Even though it was proposed in 1924 and passed Congress in the 1970s, even though it wasn't ratified, the Equal Rights Amendment has never been a thing.
The House has passed an amendment to the Civil Rights Act that would make it illegal to discriminate against people on the basis of their sexual orientation and their gender identity. While that's not a constitutional amendment, it is something that the federal government could theoretically enforce, and the Supreme Court has been doing a lot of work bringing in sexual orientation and gender identity as parts of the 14th Amendment, even though it doesn't actually say it in the 14th Amendment. So there is some interesting things being done on that.
That's actually one of the ways that 1920 was kind of better. Women across the nation were allowed to vote for the first time, though many had already been voting in the West. So we haven't seen an expansion of women's rights in 2019 and 2020. So let's get to the most foreboding part of this list, and possibly the most unknown part. You see, in 1920 to 21, the US went into a depression. Now, most economists who study this thing think it was related to World War I. You know, all that spending doesn't come free. But there was also all that fear-mongering and strife just after the war as well, plus Spanish flu striked again in early 1919. So all of those market forces combined meant that there was a huge drop in the market, and this meant that there was a huge amount of unemployment. Kind of similar to what we're experiencing in 2020. And that's kind of scary, because right now we're seeing a huge market drop. When I last calculated it, it was 35% drop in the Dow, except for suddenly we've had a huge turn. I'm recording this on a Friday, so yeah. The whole market situation is just all kinds of volatile, which is pretty much exactly what happened in 1920, except for right now, it's even more volatile.
Well, the market dropped another time right after this video was released, one of the worst drops in American history. It has basically recovered, and there's still that kind of question of how much the stock market reflects the overall economy. Because, for instance, we have companies like Amazon, Google, Facebook, and all that who have basically had no effect on their bottom line from all this. Folks like Jeff Bezos, for instance, have actually made many more billions during the pandemic, while millions of Americans are unemployed right now. I wouldn't be surprised if some of the folks watching this right now are unemployed and have nothing else to do, and that's why they're watching it. We are in such a weird time in terms of American economics where the upper class can be doing so extraordinarily well, and the labor class, or the service class, because we don't really have a labor economy anymore, but the service economy is so oddly set up that essentially the bottom quarter of the market can be basically starving to death while the upper quarter are living large. And it would appear, because of the stock market, that the economy is good. This is the effect of neoliberalism. This is bringing back the Gilded Age. You know, historians have often spoken of our current era as the second Gilded Age. There's parallels to 1920 and there's parallels to 1890. But also in terms of stocks, there's the whole Wall Street bets situation. And that's causing a bunch of market volatility in that. But honestly, I don't really have a problem with market volatility. What I have a problem with is what it might signify. Because the market often does signify the economy as a whole. And we are seeing record levels of unemployment right now. And if it gets worse, there's a sort of Damocles over our heads right now. And we don't know if it's going to drop. Yeah, it's somehow has gotten even more uncertain since I made this video.
Part of the unemployment surge in 1920 were all the soldiers coming back, whereas now it's all the people getting laid off because of coronavirus. Kind of the same thing when you think about it. It is a short-term job loss. But if this drop is a repetition compared to what happened in 1920, then we are not looking at the next couple of years as being very good. They're going to be possibly worse than 2008. And having lost a job in 2008 because of that recession, the idea of everything getting worse than that is kind of a scary thought. Like, unemployment right now is worse than it was in 2008, though this is temporary compared to what happened in 2008.
Ha ha ha. You saw that little hopefully on there? Yeah, this is a lot more long. A year is a lot longer than like a few weeks, like everybody thought it was going to be. Because at this point, the idea was that essentially everybody would shut in and the coronavirus would peter out in a matter of weeks. That didn't happen. Things could be even worse than I'm making it sound here, and I'm making it sound pretty dire.
Nate, we are seeing unemployment levels at the rate that we haven't seen since the Great Depression. And I really have no consolation here because this could be something that the market bounces back, just like what happened in 1987, or this can lead to a depression, which we haven't been in since 1940. So most of us have no idea how bad a depression can get, and if 1920 is an indicator for 2020, we're bound for one.
But before the party comes a hangover.
It's called the Depression for a reason. But in 1920, there was another indicator that I am even more ambivalent about what that means, because it was an election year. The Republican candidate, Warren G. Harding, ran on a platform that said that he would return the nation to normalcy. Funny enough, even people then made fun of the fact that that was a made-up word. But the idea was that the Wilson administration had been just utterly crazy and really needed to just get back to good old market forces. So Harding kind of abandoned progressivism. But the Republican and Democratic parties are not the same as they were in 1920. And basically, the current Democrats are very similar to the 1920s Republicans. Since now that Joe Biden is basically assured the Democratic ticket, couldn't you see him running on a platform saying a return to normalcy? That seems pretty much exactly his...
I was spot on this point, even though I'm making it sound all vague. I was dead on.
His MO. And Harding was known as the ladies' president. He was the first president to be elected after the 19th Amendment, and Funny enough, in 1919, just before the election, he had just had an illegitimate child, so, you know, he was a ladies' man. Ha ha ha. Well, also, Biden seems the same kind of... Ugh. He's got sexual assault accusations, and everybody makes fun of him for being a little too handsy. Harding was known as a heartthrob. I don't know where that comes from, so... Is Biden just a colorized version of Harding? So Biden is very much like Harding in the whole return to normalcy thing. He has been running specifically as somebody who can defeat Trump and bring politics back to normal. But that leads to the next question mark.
And I was right. Yeah. Like, of the two question marks, one's still a question mark, and the other one's like solid. Got it right. Nice.
An economic boom. Because that 1920 to 21 depression ended, though there is a lot of debate as to why. For instance, the Republicans raised tariffs, and they argue that's what saved the economy. Protectionary tariffs. And that's still very much a Republican thing today. But in either case, if we do see an economic boom, that's what made the Roaring '20s roaring. It was everybody was making money hand over fist. Well, obviously not everybody. So that would mean that the rest of the 2020s are really good. We just have a couple of years of strife ahead of us. So let's move on to the final check mark, new media. At the turn of the 20th century, a bunch of forms of media were in their infancy. Phonographs, radio, and movies all coming about and starting to gain popularity. But after World War I, that's when they all exploded in popularity. Everyone could suddenly afford it. And along with these new media types came new genres. For instance, the rise of jazz. And all this came about from supplanting things like sheet music, plays, and vaudeville. So at the turn of the 20th century, you had the rise of a new type of media. And at the turn of the 21st century, we have the rise of a whole new media. The very platform this is on is new media. It's a brave new world of media, and we're seeing a bunch of new genres as a result. Now, there's not a clear dividing line like 1918, but it's something like 78% of Americans watch YouTube, so adoption is pretty high. So that's the end of the list. Let's go over a few takeaways that I can say for sure. First, no, this pandemic is not comparable to 1918. Nowhere close. 100,000 people is not 100 million people.
And even though I said 100,000 there, even if it gets well beyond the 3 million that it is currently, that's still nowhere close. US death toll is pretty gnarly. That's going to take some serious historical investigation, because there's a huge question as to why the US was so much worse than everyone else. Although it might have something to do with the name that currently is on the screen. You know, that's still an open question, and we won't know for years. The total death toll is 3 million right now, versus 50 million, which is apples and oranges. So I was still correct, I just got the numbers wrong because, you know, this is right at the beginning of the pandemic.
Also, this president's negligence and malignance is definitely not comparable to Wilson's. Remember, hindsight is something that you have to gain steadily. And while a bunch of people are saying, this is the worst president ever, it's been trending on Twitter, for instance, no, nowhere close. You don't have a president openly fostering the KKK and...
Stand back and stand by, everyone.
Proud Boys, stand back and stand by.
Stand by me. Stand by me.
Dog whistling is one thing. Literally proclaiming that the KKK is the greatest thing to save the South and, you know, screening the movie that quotes you in the White House, yeah, that's quite a bit worse, to say the least. Well, I'm still correct here. It got worse, somehow. Trump got worse. Here, I'm being really nice to him, and maybe I shouldn't have been.
Ignoring the killing of thousands of people in the streets, or intervening to try to push democracy everywhere, while also very obviously favoring white countries to not kill people in. All the troubles we have now in terms of interventionism and the presidency being used as some sort of platform for hatred are pretty much legacies of Wilson. So which one's worse, the soldier or the general ordering the soldier to do bad things? That's basically the relationship between Wilson and Trump. Plus, we're at a point where global leaders are actually kind of less important than they were in 1920. We don't need to create another Treaty of Versailles. And when dealing with these kinds of emergencies, we can take decisive measures in ways that we couldn't in 1920. Heck, this current coronavirus probably wouldn't even be considered a threat in 1920. That's how far we've changed. We live in times of relative peace, and if we are bound for another depression, at least the US is taking proactive measures to counteract it. And best of all, we're not prohibiting alcohol, so we can drink our sorrows away.
Cheers.
All of these things show that we're far better off than we were in 1920. But there are some foreboding things. For instance, we're not taking any significant steps towards progress like we did in 1919 with women's suffrage. It's been 28 years since the last constitutional amendment, and the Equal Rights Amendment is still nowhere close to being ratified. Yes, I know the arguments about indefinite ratification periods, but that's not actually how the law works. That would be unconstitutional to try to amend the Constitution through unconstitutional means. No, it would require Congress passing the ERA again and sending it out for ratification again, which is nowhere close to happening. Plus, we may be entering a depression for the first time since 1929. Ugh. And a return to normalcy is just a return to technocratic neoliberalism. The very thing that got us in this mess in the first place. So we're watching significant change right before our very eyes, aka history. And looking back to see how history might repeat itself is only a half measure, because, well, history doesn't repeat itself, even though it does have a tendency to rhyme. So history doesn't tell us what we should do, only what has been done before. And what may have worked then may not work now. So really, we can only study history to learn from our mistakes, to try to stop things from repeating that we don't want to repeat. After all, when looking back at 1920, hindsight is 2020.
Okay, I'll admit that I totally made this episode just to make that joke. That was the actual reason for making this entire episode, was to make that stupid joke at the end. That was the 1920 versus 2020 episode, and although I did freaking, kind of reveal my hand that it was ultimately about making some stupid joke, I hope that, my commentary here has been enough to, update it a little bit. The fact is, I still stand by most of what I said there. I was surprisingly good, although I did end up not going far enough in a number of ways. I was really conservative in my estimates, and the overall takeaway of that, it's not as bad as 1920. I was correct there. I was absolutely correct. There's no question about that. Some of them didn't exactly age as well as they should have, but overall, it still holds up pretty well. So when I do edit this whole thing, I think I'm going to leave the original video up, change the title to update C description or something like that, and then put this up as kind of an addendum. Hopefully this updated version has been a good addendum to how prediction just is never a very good thing. Prediction is always bound to fail, even when I have all of this history behind me. While the overall statement of the video is still very much correct, it did need some updating, and hopefully this did that. Thanks for watching.